Resilience. A resilient life. That's what I want to talk about briefly. When I think about Calcutta, we are here to celebrate 30 years of being in Calcutta, 30 years of our relationship with God, 30 years of our friendship, even with each other. Many of us found our spouses here. I know I did. We have many fond memories, but also some of us, we do not have a bit not so fond memories too. Right? In the last 30 years, God has taught us many lessons, great memories. But I also want to acknowledge that in the last 30 years, we have also made a lot of mistakes. Some of you, we have caused you hurt and pain. Maybe by the words we have said, by our action, maybe by harsh words that we spoke to you, by being harsh and not being gracious, not able to understand you or your situation and passing a judgment on you. And I know we can't undo that, but all that I would like you to do is say that I'm sorry. And I would ask you, can you forgive us? Your hurt, your pain is real. As I said, we can't undo the things that we did wrong, but at least we just want to acknowledge the wrong that we have done, and we do want to move forward without repeating those mistakes. Also, the last 30 years, Calcutta Church has contributed to the Indian churches, and something that we can be proud of. We have Russell Kaka, who is an evangelist right now in the Delhi church, who was baptized in Calcutta. His cousin sister, Alan, who is a women's ministry leader in the Delhi church. We have Ajit Paricha, who was baptized in Calcutta, who is right now leading the church in Ranchi along with Sushmita. They're expecting their first child anytime right now. Please keep them in your prayers. That's the reason why Ajit could not come over here. He wanted to be with us. Of course, God used Kiran Lama and his wife Lucky to establish the church in Gangtok and as well as in Kalimpong. We have Henry and Arunima, who were baptized in Calcutta, who led the mission team to Bhubaneswar, and they served in Delhi and are now back again helping out the church in Bhubaneswar. And of course, Calcutta Church helped out in planting the church in Dhaka, Bangladesh in 1996. So why did I choose the theme for this today, resilient? Because the word resilience basically means a quality to adapt to a stressful life changes and bouncing back from hardship. It's a response to a tragedy, crisis, or other life-altering changes that allow us to move on in spite of the challenges and loss. Showing resilience does not mean that a person is unaffected or uncaring about life changes. Resilience means having the ability to suffer greatly and grow with it. And that is what this city reminds me. The city reminds me of willing to bounce back. The people of this city reminds me of that. The disciple, the church reminds me. And of course, all of you remind me of the willingness to bounce back after facing challenges. Each one of you have a story to tell today. A story of resilience. Now, resilience does not mean you will not fall, or you will not fail, or you will not make mistakes. It basically means when we do fall, when we do fail, when we do mess up, what we do after that, that matters. In Luke chapter 22, verse 31 and 32, we see Peter, Jesus talking to Peter. And he says, I'll read in English, he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked me to sift all of you as a wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. What we see over here is, Jesus telling Peter and all the others that they will be tested. And we know Peter failed. Remember in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested, he ran away with the other disciples. At the trial of Jesus, Peter was there, but he denied Jesus 3 times. And yet, Jesus tells Peter that when you have bounced back, when you have turned back, you will fall. When you turn back, you bounce back, make sure you help others to bounce back. When we are resilient, when we bounce back, we don't realize it, but we inspire others to bounce back. We give others the hope to bounce back. This morning I want to share about a person in the Bible that not much gets preached about him. But that person has played a very important role that impacts even today. The person's name is John Mark. The Bible actually never refers anyone by the name of John Mark. But several passages in the book of Acts refers to a man as John, also called Mark. Now in the first century, John was the most common Hebrew name. And Mark was the common Roman name. It wasn't unusual for someone to go both by a Hebrew name and a Roman name, because even Paul, also called Saul, also had the same. Now who was John Mark? The first time his name is mentioned in Acts chapter 12 verse 12. Now in the book of Acts chapter 12, Herod, gets Peter arrested and wants to put him to death. And here Peter is in prison, sleeping, chained between two soldiers. And if you remember that, the angel of the Lord came in the middle of the night while the soldiers were sleeping, while Peter was sleeping, woke Peter up and freed him from the prison. Peter thought that he was seeing a dream. And then in verse 12 it says, when this dawned on him, what happened? He went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. So this was the first house that Peter went to, John Mark's house, after he was freed from the prison. It looked like their home was open for fellowship, because it says that while Peter was in the prison, there were others who had gathered in that home and they were praying for Peter. In Colossians chapter 4 verse 10, the Bible said that he was also a cousin of Barnabas. Remember Barnabas and Saul? He was the cousin of Barnabas. In Acts 12:25 it says that Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission and they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also Mark. So John Mark was also a companion of Barnabas and Saul on their missionary journey. Now let's look in Acts 15:36 to 38 about John Mark.
Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work.
As Paul and Barnabas, they were thinking about, hey, all the missionary journey, let's go back and encourage all those churches, all those disciples. As they were discussing to go back, who to take, in verse 37, Barnabas wanted to take his cousin John, also called Mark, but Paul refused to take John Mark with them. Why was that? Verse 38 it says, because John Mark had deserted them in one of those places. In fact, in Acts 13:13 also it says that John Mark left them and returned back to Jerusalem. Why do you think he left them? Why do you think he went back? Maybe he was a young lad, young fellow, maybe felt homesick, wanted to go back home. Maybe first time away from family, missed his family. Maybe fearful of persecution, because wherever Paul went, he would get into trouble. Maybe John Mark was discouraged because life was hard as a missionary in those days, and he was not used to it. Whatever the reason was, we see that he fell from grace in the eyes of Paul. In Acts 15:39 to 41, let's read. It says, so what happened, and I'll read in English, it said they had such a sharp disagreement, who? Barnabas and Saul, that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went to Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So we see over here two giant men of faith having a disagreement, right? And I guess even among us as disciples, we will have disagreements, right? And in this agreement, it led to both of them parting ways, but they both continued to serve God. Now, why was Barnabas so determined to take John Mark with him? Of course, one of the reasons we saw in Colossians 4:10 was maybe because John Mark was his cousin, right? So, hey, let me take my cousin brother with me. But the other reason, which I feel very strongly also, is, remember, what is he called? He's called the son of encouragement. That was his name. He was a people's person. He always believed in people. He always believed in giving people second chance. He always believed in encouraging people. In fact, isn't that what he did with Saul? When Saul became a disciple and he wanted to join the disciples, everybody was afraid. It was Barnabas who believed in him, took him, and presented him to the apostles. So if I had to ask you between Paul and Barnabas, who is right? Or who was right? Barnabas taking John Mark, or Saul not taking John Mark? How many of you think Barnabas was right? Raise your hands up. Now, there's no right and wrong answers, okay? I just want to... Come on. Okay, how many of you think what Saul did was right by not taking John Mark? And rest of you are undecided. Neutral. Right? That is the safest place to be, right? Okay. Now, Barnabas prioritized John Mark because he believed in giving second chance. No doubt about that. But Paul was prioritizing having a reliable partner because they were on a difficult missionary journey. Now, both of them were sincere and had valid points. One was full of grace. I believe in second chance. While Paul was very objective, where he was like, you don't leave your partner behind. That was his attitude. And, John Mark fell from the grace in the eyes of Paul. And I'm sure that was very discouraging for John Mark to see, that Paul did not want to take him. So what do you think happened to John Mark after that? Did he get discouraged and quit? Did he bounce back? Was he resilient enough? Let's find out. Now, years later, we don't know how long, Paul is writing different letters to different churches. Philemon 1, 23 and 24. As he's writing the letter to Philemon, what does he say? That, who is my fellow prisoner with me right now? One of them is Mark, along with Luke and Demas. So we see over here that Mark is actually a fellow prisoner of Paul years later. Now, one of them was Demas. Remember, one of his fellow workers in Demas? You see that? Now, let's look in 2 Timothy 4, 9 and 11. Now, between Philemon and 2 Timothy, what happened to Demas? He must have got discouraged, like John Mark. He decided to, and in fact, it says over here, somehow Paul has always had this. He says, Demas, because you love this world, had deserted me. One more, he had a deserting. Paul was in prison in Rome by this time when he's writing 2 Timothy. Several people had abandoned Paul while he was in prison, and others were on on different assignments on a missionary journey. He's allowed to have visitors, and so who is he requesting for? In the last line, if you read, he says, get Mark, bring him to me because he's helpful to me in my ministry. So we see over here, John Mark has bounced back to be a great help to Paul. In Colossians 4, 10 and 11, again Paul is calling John Mark as my co-worker and someone who comforted me in my difficult times. So what changed? What helped John Mark to bounce back? What made him such an important part of Paul's life and ministry at the later stages of Paul? According to me, there are two things that happened in John Mark's life that helped him to bounce back. Number one is grace, and number two is truth. He experienced grace from Barnabas. While Paul did not want to take John Mark, Barnabas was the one who said, hey, come with me. He believed everyone deserves a second chance. And so one thing that we got to understand is time is a healing factor. When you give time to some people, they really change. John Mark just needed some time to figure out and some time to grow up. But on the other hand, it was not only grace, but also John Mark needed to hear the truth. And Paul was the one who spoke the truth to John Mark on his face without mincing any words. Things in his life that he needed to see so that he could change. So even for us this morning, as we look at our life, if we want to be resilient, if we want to bounce back in life, that we need both. We need someone who will show us grace and who will believe in us, but we also need someone who will speak the truth to us in our face. If you only have grace and no truth, then it gives us the license to sin. But if you only have truth, but no one shows you grace or believes in you, it just gets you discouraged and you want to quit. Both Barnabas and Paul played a role in his life so that he could bounce back. Now, why does John Mark play such an important role? Because many times we don't realize it, but according to many scholars, the Gospel of Mark, remember one of the Gospel of Mark, was written by John Mark. He had later on, after Paul, he had later on joined Peter in Rome, and it was in Rome, according to the Christian tradition, Mark wrote down Peter's version of the Gospel. First Gospel that ever was written was the book of Mark by John Mark. And later on, Matthew and Luke used Mark's Gospel as a base as they wrote their own Gospel. Can you imagine what would have happened if John Mark did not bounce back? If he was not resilient? We won't have the book of Mark, the oldest Gospel on the life of Jesus. At least we won't have it from Mark. The reason we have the Gospel of Mark is because Mark was resilient. He bounced back, and his impact is even impacting us today. When we read the book of Mark, it inspires us to know more about Jesus. Can you imagine if you don't bounce back? If you are not resilient, can you imagine that you will not able to impact someone else? You will not able to impact your children and the next generation and generations to come. We don't realize it, but when we bounce back, it impacts generations. Today, in conclusion, maybe you are John Mark. You failed in life, fallen from grace in the eyes of people around. Now, like John Mark, we can bounce back. And we need to bounce back. We only have one chance at life. We can't let it go like that. No. And for us to bounce back, we need both Paul and we need Barnabas in our lives. Someone who will encourage you and believe in you, but someone who will also speak the truth. Maybe you're like Paul. You're always straightforward and objective. I always tell the truth the way it is. If you're like Paul, then let's remember, people need a second. Let's give people a second chance to bounce back. Let's not write off people just because they made some mistakes. Or maybe you're Barnabas. You always want to encourage, you always believe in people giving a second chance. Keep doing that, but don't forget, we also need to speak the truth in love. And in conclusion, there is one person in the Bible who was a perfect example of truth and grace was Jesus. In John chapter 1 verse 14, it says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory and the glory of one and only Son, who came from Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus was the perfect example of one who was full of grace, but also full of truth. So this morning, I just want to encourage us that let us live a resilient life.